Hello and welcome to the Astranti Financial Training Preseen analysis for the May 2017 operational case study exam where the Preseen company is Ashworth Lea. So my name is James and I'm a co-director here at Astranti. Been with Astranti for several years now, and at one time or another I've been involved with pretty much every single aspect of production within the business, including the case study exam, so you're in safe hands with me. Just to go through a few more things, I'm a mock writer, so the case studies when they started for CIMA back in 2015, we've been doing specialised case study products ever since. One of those are mock exams, and I've written several of the mocks that we've released over the years. And I also consider myself something of a case study expert. Like I say, the case study exam started back in 2015, and ever since then I've been involved in one way or another with pretty much every pre-scene and case study. That's at operational management or strategic level. Been involved in pretty much everyone in one way or another since its inception. So I know a lot about how the case study works, how the pre-scene works, and how the pre-scene sets itself up for the exam later on. In addition to that, I've also actually written a real case study exam for CIMA back in 2015. We wrote a CIMA Asia exam that was actually used in a real exam over in the CIMA Asia region. And so not only have I been looking and experienced with case studies for a few years, but I've actually written one as well. So I've wrote the pre-scene, and I know what's involved and how the pre-scene is a really good guide to the kind of things that's going to come up in the exam. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, I'm one of the main study text authors here at Astranti, and I've been involved again with pretty much every study text that has come out, and that includes all levels and all pillars. So my actual area of expertise are the finance pillar, so the F1 and F2 study texts, but I've worked on the enterprise pillar and the P pillar as well, so there's not really much that I haven't looked at in my time here. I've got a good general all-round knowledge, which is perfect for the case study exams. So what can you expect from this video series? What are we going to do? Why is it worth anything to you? Why is it worth your time? So the first thing we're going to do is we're really going to take the pre-scene that's been given, and we're just going to go through it with a fine-tooth comb, looking at every little detail as we go through, because as I said, getting to know the pre-scene and having a good understanding of the pre-scene is really the best way to be prepared for the exam. So what particularly we're going to focus on are some of the key points. So as we go through, I'll be making key points, areas that as I read through, I think, well, that's definitely going to be an important thing, and that's almost certainly going to be relevant at some stage in the exam. We're going to be having some industry guidance on how it relates. So I've spent the past few weeks going through everything that I could find on the particular industry that we're involved in on this occasion, and I'm going to be bringing that to the pre-scene and making it relevant and applying it to the scenario, so we have a real world feel for how this all fits together and what kind of things the company are going to be dealing with. We're going to be looking at all the key business models, so of course we're going to be thinking about PESTLE, Portfolio Forces, all the kind of business models that we can use to assess and analyse the company, their areas of strength, the weaknesses, and how they may go forward in the future, what kind of things you could say in your exam, because often your role is to advise or to give some kind of information, and one of the best ways to do that are using the classic business models. We're going to be picking up likely exam issues, so those first 3 points there, they all kind of feed down into what are likely things to come up in the exam. And like I said, I wrote one of the pre-scenes for an exam a few years ago, and so the best thing to do really when you're approaching the pre-scene is to kind of read between the lines and think, well, CIMA have written this pre-scene, they've made up this company, and it is a real life industry, but it's a made up company, and you've got to think, well, what areas are they setting themselves up for so they can think of exam scenarios when it actually comes to the exam. So if you look at it in that way, think, well, why have they written it like this? Probably because they've got an exam question that they want to ask about that particular area. So as we go through, I'll be picking out areas of the pre-scene that I think are very likely to be coming up in the exam. And as well as that, I'll be giving some exam hints and tips. So at Stranti, we've got a couple of study texts and textbooks on specifically how to pass your case study exams, and I was heavily involved in the writing of those, so I know plenty about the exams and the extra little tidbits and tips and things that can help you to get through the exam beyond just pure knowledge and application. In addition to the pre-scene videos, so there's going to be a number of pre-scene videos just looking at the pre-scene, we're going to have a strategic analysis, and that won't necessarily involve looking at the pre-scene in too much more depth. We'll already have covered that. This is kind of a big picture, broader look at the company, where they stand and what they can do going forward. And we'll have a specific video dedicated to the top 10 issues. So I'm going to give you 10 things that I think are very likely to come up in the exam in February based on the things that we'll see in the pre-scene. And there's usually a pretty good track record here at Astranti. We're quite proud of the fact that our top 10 issues, more often than not, most of them are things that actually come up in the exam. So that's what you can expect, and here's how it will work. So in the section by section pre-scene videos, I'm going to assume that you haven't seen the pre-scene yet. And you can assume that I haven't really seen it either, because I've been through it a little bit, I've made some notes, but a lot of it we'll be doing as we go through. So you can assume that I'm not going to take any knowledge for granted here. And so what you can do is, before you watch my video and see what I say about it, have a go at reading through it yourself, make some notes, and see how much you can come up with on your own. See how well you do there. And when you've made your own notes, come back to the video and have a look at what I've said, and then maybe see if there's anything that you've missed out or not covered in enough depth, or perhaps there might even be things that you think are good points that I haven't covered myself. And you're welcome to leave a comment and perhaps add anything that you think we've missed out. You're perfectly welcome to do that. And at the end, we'll go through the strategic analysis video and the top 10 issues video. So in total, you're looking at, depending on the length of the pre-scene, sort of 8 or 9 videos in total. So just a few quick notes on the actual pre-scene and your approach to the pre-scene actually that I want to make before we start looking at the thing itself. Context is key here, so the whole idea of the pre-scene is to set up this realistic scenario, this realistic world in which this business operates. And so it's important to always think about the context when we're looking at the issues. Don't write a thing based on the pre-scene before the exam. So do go through the pre-scene in a lot of depth and get as much out of it as you can, but don't assume that you can sort of write your answers to questions before you go into the actual exam, because, as you know, we don't know what's going to be in the exam, and you might waste your time focusing on this one particular issue, and that's one of the issues that doesn't come up in the exam. So don't try to write anything based on the pre-scene. Just use it as a way to learn as much as you can about the business, so you can be well prepared in the exam. And the real function of the pre-scene, as we said, it's the background. You're really, if you imagine that you are in a real business for a moment, just suspend disbelief and imagine that you have the actual job of finance officer or whatever it is at this business, and that you're going to be asked to advise or analyze or evaluate certain areas of the business to your boss. So the best way that you would ever be able to do that is to know as much as possible as you can about the business you're working in and the industry they're working in. So that's all this is. The pre-scene is kind of this report that gives you the key information, as much of it as possible, so you can give good answers in the exam. So that's the best approach that I can advise that you take when watching these videos and getting ready for the exam. Okay, so let's get started with the pre-scene then. So the company is called Ashworth Lea, and based on the picture that we have on the front page, this is something to do with cars. So let's go ahead and skip to the very first page and see what we find out. So we have the job description. Often the pre-scene will start out with a job description, so we know exactly what your role is within the company. Now this is how CIMA set up the exam so that you know what is expected of you going into it. So you are one of 2 finance officers at Ashworth Lea. So there's 2 of you and a finance officer. If you don't know,
They're basically the bottom rung in the accounting department. You are the people that are doing all the basic kind of data entry and putting together data and numbers for perhaps budgets or reports for the management. And so you'll be reporting to higher ups in your team, perhaps a team leader, and perhaps even above that you'll have an overall manager. And in this case, your main role is to support the senior management accountant. So you're in the management accounting department, and there'll be a separate financial accounting department, but that's all part of the all part of the overall accounting department. And this is probably what you would expect at this level in a CIMA exam. Obviously, CIMA, management accountant, so you're on the management accountants team. But obviously, thinking back to your studies, this level is made up of E1, P1, and F1. And obviously F1 is financial reporting, and it's important to know about financial reporting in order to be a good management accountant as well. And so basically what CIMA is saying here is you are on the management accountant team. That's going to be your primary focus, but you're going to be asked to assist other finance staff as well. So that means that you could easily get something thrown into the mix that's coming from the financial accountants. Perhaps you have to help with putting together some financial reports, or you have to help with an interpretation of a standard or something like that. These are all questions that come up again and again in the case study exams. And so what is happening here, CIMA is saying, okay, you are a management accountant, but you still have to know your financial accounting stuff. Okay, so that's really all we need to get from this description. A few other things that was probably worth noting while we're still on this page. Specifically, you're involved with the production of the annual budget. So you would have been, if there's a budget included in this pre-scene, you were involved in that. You produce the monthly management accounts, and you provide information to management as required. So again, largely on the management accounting side of things, but still don't neglect the financial side. Obviously, F1 is 1/3 of the entire syllabus, and so you'd be silly to ignore that completely. So let's move on to the actual first page and learn a bit about the company. So Ashworth Lea is a producer of high quality, prestigious motor cars. So let's just highlight that. Producer of high quality and prestigious motor cars. Now, just in that first sentence alone, we can get a pretty good idea of a few things that we can start bringing from the things we've studied in E1, P1 and F1. So let's just think about this producer at the moment. So we know they produce motor cars, but what kind of things are specific to a production company that may not be as specific to a retailer or a provider of a service? So let's think about some things that we can take from E1, P1 and F1 that are relevant to a producer. So in P1 then, the main things that are relevant here and are sort of the core elements of management accounting are costing and budgeting. Now these two, obviously these are just two words on the page at the moment, but these make up a significant part of the P1 syllabus, and they're bound to come up in the pre-scene as well. So a company that produces their own goods to sell, they're going to be interested in costing, how those costs are allocated to various parts of the business, how that is sort of filtered through into the pricing as well. And that's going to be a key consideration as we're going through this. And much in the same way, budgeting as well. So what costing methods are used are obviously going to impact the way that the company makes budgets for the next year or the next 5 years or the next 10 years as well. So those are the key things from P1. Thinking about F1, the main things here then, the main parts of F1 that we're going to be trying to pull through and think about are working capital. So there's a large part of the syllabus is about working capital management, how to manage your inventory, your receivables and your payables, terms of credit to use to the best of your advantage, ways of managing cash. All of these parts of the F1 syllabus are going to be really important when we come to analysing some of the finance and the figures that we're bound to be giving in the pre-scene later on. And inventory management obviously comes into that, and we're going to be doing plenty of analysis of the working capital when we get to the figures later on in the pre-scene. And the main parts of E1 that we're going to be thinking about are marketing and the organizational structure. So these two things are probably more applicable to any kind of company that you'd be given in a pre-scene, but in this case it's worth just keeping in mind that we're going to be thinking about their marketing strategy, if they even have one, and if they do, what kind of strategy are they using for their products, And also we're going to be looking at the organizational structure. We're going to be given a chart of the structure, and we'll be able to analyze things like their governance and to see if that's done well, how the various functions are set up and managed in the company, and if that's done well as well. So these are just a few of the things, just from the very first sentence, that we can already start to put those in the back of our mind to be pulled forward at any time and think, okay, here's something to do with the working capital, and we can analyze that and get a good idea of how the company is working. Okay, so moving on, Ashworth Lea, their origins stem from the initial friendship and subsequent partnership of Robert Ashworth and Andrew Lea, obviously where they get the name from. Let's just highlight those names there. So Ashworth and Lea, these are the founders, and this was founded in the early part of the 20th century. Now this is not super important information, but it's interesting information, and it helps us give an idea of the age of the company and see how well they're established. So lots and lots of car companies were established in the early part of the 20th century. Just to give a few examples, you have Ford, one of the most popular and well-known car manufacturers in the world, Mercedes, Aston Martin, which is a company we'll be coming back to as well, because a lot of what we learn about Ashworth Lea is actually, it seems to be modelled on Aston Martin. So a lot of the big names now were established in the early part of the 20th century, which means they've been around for around about 100 years now, which is a long time for a business to be in operation. And many companies will have fallen by the wayside too. The car industry is very competitive, highly competitive market. Lots of people, lots of companies enter this market and they don't do so well. It's a difficult one to master. And so to have been around for 100 years and to still be going, that's a pretty good start. That's a pretty successful company. They've obviously managed to find their feet and their USP, and they're doing quite well. Now, for those of you that don't know much about the car industry, 100 years ago is roughly around the same sort of time that the car industry really started to get its footing and mass production of vehicles was done for the first time on a large scale. Before that, it was largely something that it had been going on for a long time, but not on the scale that it's done today. Ford were one of the first companies to produce cars on a mass scale and make them available to the public. Before that, it was very much a much smaller, smaller endeavour. And actually, before we move on, something I forgot to mention here is that the high quality, prestigious motor cars. Now, obviously, there are lots of different ways to go about making motor cars. Ford have the approach of mass production. It's something they established, like I say, about 100 years ago. They make a lot of different kinds of cars. But this is a high quality, prestigious motor car producer. So that means probably the model or the business strategy is more like very few number of products are made over the course of a year, but they're very costly and expensive to produce. They're very high quality, prestigious luxury cars, and so only a few of them need to be sold over the course of the year in order for the company to keep itself going. And just to give you a few examples of companies that do use this business model, we have Jaguar, Alfa Romeo, Bentley, Porsche. All of these companies make very high quality top-end cars that are very, very expensive, not to buy for the customer and also to produce, but only a very small amount of them are sold throughout the course of the year, compared to companies like Ford or Volkswagen, who produce thousands and thousands of cars every year, but they're sold for a much lower price. Okay, so the company is located in Midfield, which is a town in the country of Mayland. Now, we don't need to worry too much about where it's based or anything like that, but looking at this, it's probably loosely, roughly based on a country like the United Kingdom. Or if not the UK, then a country similar to the UK, perhaps in Western Europe or something like that. Now, like I say, not too important to focus on that, but it just gives us an idea of the kind of place that Mayland is. Okay, so just after doing that first paragraph then, we need to start thinking about some more of the syllabus that we can bring forward and to help us analyze the company. So just from that very first paragraph, what we're going to do is start thinking about some of the elements of PESTLE. Now, PESTLE is a tool you can use to analyze the environment in which the company finds itself in, and it's an acronym. So the P is political, E for economic, S for social, T for technological, E for environment, and L for legal. And that gives you the 6 kind of main areas to think about with regards to how the company, or the environment in which the company operates. Now, just thinking about this quickly, we can get a few ideas thinking about this. So one of the key things for any car company is going to be technology. That's going to be a really important part, and as we'll find out later going through the Preseen, technology is obviously going to play an important role in how well this company do in the future. With things like electric cars and driverless cars getting more and more popular, there's more and more demand for that. That's going to be a key technological concern for any company that is in the automotive industry, and not just one that makes high quality, prestigious motor cars. And that also leads a little bit into some of the other factors as well. So the second E in PESTLE is environmental, and that's obviously going to be a key concern as well. So thinking about electric cars and reducing the impact on the environment, that sort of leads us into concerns about environmental issues. So obviously cars are one of the highest polluters on the planet, because there are so many of them on the roads, then this causes a large amount of pollution in the world, and this is obviously a concern for things like global warming and the greenhouse effect. And this is probably going to be a very highly rated concern within a car company, because as the world becomes more and more conscious about global warming and environmental impact of business, then this is something that the customers are going to push for more, and then the company are going to have to reflect that in their products. And again, this leads us on to the L of PESTLE as well, which stands for legal. And obviously, because of environmental concerns, there are a number of legal standards that car companies have to adhere to with regards to their production. So cars have to have emissions below a certain number. Obviously that's an environmental issue, but it's also a legal one as well, because not doing that gets you into a lot of trouble. Just a few years ago, Volkswagen, one of the biggest producers of cars in the world, faced a lot of issue in the press and in a legal sense as well, because they had been found to be sort of cheating when it comes to their emissions tests. They'd been sort of fiddling with the technology a little bit, so it appeared that their cars were causing less emissions than what actually was the case, and they got found out and they faced a lot of trouble for it, and that actually resulted in their stock price plummeting for a period of time when this scandal broke. Okay, so let's move on to the next paragraph and see what more we can find out. So Robert Ashworth, a railway engineer by profession, decided to turn his hand to designing and building the increasingly rapid developing phenomenon, the motor car. So as we've said, at the time, about 100 years ago, motor cars weren't necessarily a brand new thing, but they were still very much in the early stages of their development, and sort of every few months or every few years, a great sort of a breakthrough was made in the development of engines. So we know that Ashworth Lea were around at the beginning, really, of the car industry, and when it was sort of in its very early stages. Okay, so concentrating initially on the engineering and production of the cars, he established a good reputation and achieved early success. That's good, he achieved early success and a good reputation, selling all the production he could make to customers in the local area. So again, because the car industry was so small at the time, most of the business was done locally. He was developing cars, pretty much a one-man job, and he was doing this because he was interested in engineering. His motor cars were judged to be well engineered, well made, reliable, and practical vehicles. And it was this early success which gave him the ambition to expand production and put a business on a more commercial footing. Now, before we move on, let's just consider the words that are being used here. Well engineered, well made, reliable, practical vehicles. Now, that is obviously very high praise, and this is something that is going to be integral to the success of Ashworth Lea. It's going to be very important to their brand. They're kind of known around the world for their high quality vehicles. So if we think back to E1 and the marketing approach and marketing strategy, this is probably what Ashworth Lea are going to be relying on, their sort of reputation for making high quality, sort of luxurious vehicles. We need to read more to find out specifically what the marketing strategy is. This is obviously going to be a big part of it, and that could be a good thing, but on the bad side, this could be something that they could rely on too much, and if they rely on that too much, then that could not be enough really to keep them going for a serious amount of time. Okay, so again in the next paragraph there is more emphasis on sort of the quality. So quickly realised that a key element in the expansion plan was promoting and selling the attributes of his motor car, which were built to a high standard. So again, we've got this emphasis on quality, known for their reliability. This led him to seek the assistance of one of his lifelong friends, Andrew Lea. Again, so the two people involved, Robert Ashworth was the engineer, the designer, the one who made the cars. Andrew Lea, this is a friend who Robert has brought in, and his background was in pharmaceutical sales. So obviously pharmaceutical sales is a significantly different industry to the car industry, so it's an unrelated background, although I'm sure there are many areas that from the pharmaceutical industry can be applied to the car industry. It's not an obvious fit, and so perhaps there is an element at which Andrew Lea was brought in because he was a friend of Robert's, but he perhaps wasn't the best person for the job. But I'm sure he did a very good job. Obviously he did well enough to keep the company going for 100 years, but perhaps something like the marketing strategy was based on a pharmaceutical industry approach rather than a car industry approach, and perhaps that is why there is such an emphasis on the high quality and perhaps not enough on other areas, or going down other areas of the marketing approach. Okay, so Andrew was keen to take the opportunity to be involved, and together they developed product and sales strategies that would take the company successfully through many years. Okay, so moving on again then. The company was consistently associated with high quality, premium priced, low volume. So as we said earlier, this is kind of the strategy or the pricing model used at least for Ashworth Lea. So they have high quality, very high priced cars, but they only produce perhaps 100, 500 or 1,000 throughout the course of a year. And that's enough to keep them going year on year. And they established a reputation for its range of sports touring cars. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of car, and again, for those of you who don't know much about the car industry, there are probably about 8 to 10 different ways of grouping all the different kinds of cars, from sort of compact small cars. So you have classic hatchbacks, and city cars are very small cars that tend to be efficient and small. Then you go up through the ranges to sort of family cars. Then you get saloons and sedans, luxury cars, which are a bit bigger. And then you move on to sports cars, and there's lots of different kinds of cars. Something that should definitely be looked up if it's not something you know about. A sports touring car is a specific kind of car that kind of combines a sort of sporty look, a high performance vehicle with something that is also luxurious and not just sporty, but also sort of usable, works well, is reliable, and so it takes the best of both of those worlds. Now compare that to something like the Ford Fiesta, which is a kind of smaller, compact hatchback car, mass-produced. It's not known for its performance or its design necessarily, but it's a very practical, affordable car that a lot more people can afford, and that's a completely different way of producing a car and marketing it. So this is where Ashworth Lea are within the context of the car industry. They're at the top end, they're making high performance, reliable luxury cars that are expensive and not necessarily for the average car buyer who perhaps has a much smaller budget and needs something practical rather than something very expensive and luxurious. And so the company has a reputation as a niche producer with worldwide sales. So niche is obviously a very small segment of the market. But if it's done in the right way, if they have a good marketing approach and they can establish their brand worldwide and get enough sales, then that's a very comfortable position to be in. Okay, so moving on to the next paragraph again. Vehicles with the Ashworth Lea badge became desirable collector's items and were favoured by contemporary film producers. They featured as prominent stars, so presumably here we mean the actual cars, so the cars featured as prominent stars in many highly successful films. Now, this brings us back to Aston Martin. Now, for those of you who don't know, Aston Martin are a British car manufacturer, have been around for around about 100 years, and they are famously associated with James Bond. James Bond in the 1960s famously drove an Aston Martin car, and so here we can start to see that Ashworth Lea is probably quite sort of heavily influenced or based on Aston Martin. And this is a pretty common thing that CIMA do in these pre-scenes. They pick a real life company and they try to use aspects of it when they're producing the pre-scene company. And while we're on the subject of Aston Martin and James Bond, it's worth mentioning something here regarding Ashworth Lea. So we've established that Ashworth Lea have this reputation for high quality, premium priced, luxurious cars, and they're a desirable collector's item, and they're associated with class and luxury, and sort of there's a James Bond feel about them. They're a collectible and sort of they have worldwide instant recognition. When you have a company like that or products like that are instantly recognizable and they're associated with this classy kind of elegant, cool style, the James Bond thing, you become sort of limited in your pricing strategies. And as we've said, this is a premium price, low volume, as opposed to a sort of mid to low priced, high volume like Volkswagen or Ford. And because of the brand has this association with class and luxury, it's difficult for them to break into other pricing strategies. And a great example of this is Aston Martin, who actually tried to do the same thing a few years ago. So Aston Martin came out with this new car called the Aston Martin Signet, which was their attempt at a sort of practical, low-cost, affordable car for a sort of mass consumers, rather than this sort of high-priced, expensive luxury cars. And it didn't really do very well at all, because people associate Aston Martin with a certain level of production quality. There's a brand, there's a coolness to it, and the Signet was released, and they tried to retain elements of that in the Signet, but because it was a mass production vehicle, it didn't really, it just didn't feel like an Aston Martin. The sales weren't really great, and eventually it was discontinued. And if you haven't heard this, you can look up online the Aston Martin Signet, read some articles about it. It's a very interesting story about how a company with a certain image and the brand, with a very recognizable brand, tried to divest and do something different, and it didn't work because the customers expected Aston Martin to be Aston Martin. And in one way that's very limiting, but that can be used to their advantage as well. Okay, so let's move on again some more to the next paragraph. So ownership of the company. So now we're looking a bit more at the ownership and the sort of corporate structure, the capital structure perhaps of the company. Ownership of the company is passed down through the families of Ashworth Lea and Lea. So it stayed in the family for a while, although it has become diluted over the years due to a number of factors. What are those factors? So some family members have moved on to pursue other business interests, and two large investors, so thinking about stakeholders here, two large investors have taken a stake in the business. Okay, so bringing that back to the syllabus then, stakeholders, we're thinking about Mendelow's matrix and our stakeholder mapping and where we were going to put the stakeholders. Now obviously as their owners, they're going to be sort of high priority in the sort of top quadrant of the matrix, so they're going to be people, key players that we're going to want to keep interested and keep close. But it'll be interesting to find out as we go on exactly what the stakeholdings are of these two large investors and how much of the company the family has managed to retain over the years. So let's move on. I'll probably find out in the next few paragraphs. So around 30 years ago, so from this perspective 30 years ago would make it the 1980s. Now, that may be relevant, it may not be relevant. There's something may have been happening in the car industry in the 1980s. It's something to research and look up. But again, it may not be relevant at all. But around 30 years ago makes it the 1980s. The business almost failed. It had not developed any new models. So let's just highlight that because that's important. It had not developed any new models for a number of years because of a lack of contemporary design expertise. So basically, we can guess at what happened here. Ashworth Lea probably had a golden age through the 50s and 60s and probably into the 70s as well, where they had a few models, a few designs that ended up being products that were very, very successful, with it perhaps associated with the contemporary film producers. It's featured as stars. They became collectible and cool. And Ashworth Lea made the classic mistake of relying too much on this reputation. They didn't bother making any new products. They didn't bother investing in research and development and coming up with new ideas. And after, a decade or two, people start to get bored of it or forget about it, or newer companies come along and they've got something newer and more interesting. Obviously, by the time the 80s rolls around, that's a long time from the sort of the 60s, that's obviously James Bond, but we can sort of use that parallel there. And so there was probably a lack of innovation going on there, relying too heavily on the brand to sort of sell itself. And so that easily leads to financial trouble, as it obviously did in this case. And this is something to look out for happening again. Obviously, they're going to be very wary of this as something that's happened in the past. But again, it can happen again. Companies get too big, too comfortable. They seem to be kind of doing fine just by themselves, and they don't invest in research and development, getting new products, new marketing strategies, to getting new customers involved. And that's a very slippery slope, particularly in the car industry, which is one that is radically changing all the time with new technologies and with new competitors coming along and just taking your customers from you. Okay, so for a while it was able to survive off its reputation, as we've said, so probably too reliant on its reputation and customer loyalty, but eventually sales began to decline for the reasons we've just discussed. This, combined with outdated production facilities, so again a lack of investment in new technologies and increasing costs, threatened the existence of the company. So 30 years ago isn't that long ago. The company nearly went completely under, and it looks like, if we go on to the next paragraph, it was saved by a large mass producer of vehicles, DOM. So again, if we look to the real world for parallels and comparisons, DOM is probably going to be a company like Daimler, the company who make Mercedes, because in real life, Aston Martin also have partnered up with Daimler in the past and have been invested in by Daimler and Mercedes in the past when they were having financial difficulties. And actually, if we look at the history of Aston Martin, very similar thing happened to them when they relied too much on their brand, and they've had financial difficulties over several times throughout their history, and particularly in the 20th century. So DOM at the time were keen to promote its association with a quality manufacturer. So obviously DOM were a mass producer of vehicles. They probably had investments in other car producers, and they were looking to have a kind of diversified portfolio, as it were, so that maybe they had a few mass production car companies in their portfolio as well, and perhaps they had some other niche producers, so perhaps a sport car or something like that. And now they want a quality manufacturer as well. So DOM perhaps a kind of investment, interested in investing in lots of different car companies. And they took a 60% stake in the company. So DOM would have become the parent of Ashworth Lea in this case. So this investment was obviously a good thing, because, as we've said, they were saved by DOM. So they took a 60% stake in the company. This led to substantial investment in a new production facility, provided a much needed investment in new vehicle designs and engines. So this was a solution to the problem we had earlier. So the problem we had earlier was that Ashworth Lea perhaps were too reliant on their brand image, too comfortable. They weren't coming up with enough new designs. They weren't investing in innovation, research, development. DOM come along, they immediately see what the problem is, and they specifically put investment into those areas. So the solution to that problem was obviously to increase investment in new designs and to put money in developing the production facility so that it could keep up with the ever-changing landscape of the car industry. And it also resulted in an increase in promotional activity. So obviously DOM knew more about advertising and marketing. They probably came up with a more specific and unique to Ashworth Lea marketing strategy so that they didn't become complacent and rely too much on the brand. And so it looks like what has happened here is DOM have come in and they've kind of sorted the company out and put them on a more corporate footing so that they can survive for a longer period of time within the automotive industry. And also here they were involved in the sponsorship of a racing team. Now this is an interesting thing for a car company to do, and it's a common thing. Many car companies do it. They put money and they associate themselves with a racing team, so that if you imagine in the Formula One, one of the biggest sports in the world, watched by millions around the world, the races are sponsored by certain car companies. So in the current day, you have racers like Lewis Hamilton, one of the most famous drivers in the world at the moment, who is currently sponsored by Mercedes. Mercedes owned by Daimler, and we've already made the connection between Daimler and DOM, so there's perhaps a real-life connection there. Lewis Hamilton was previously sponsored by McLaren, who are a British car manufacturer as well. So sponsorship of a racing team, it's a good model, good idea to use in advertising and promotion as well, and that's something that's already been done, and it'd be interesting to see if that's still being done now, if Ashworth Lea are still sponsoring a racing team, because it's a good way to get people to know about the brand. And so the support provided was invaluable at such a crucial point in the development of the business. So it looks like Ashworth Lea were very, very close to going under in the 80s, and they were saved by the mass producer DOM in this case. Okay, so this section does continue over the page, so let's also have a look at that before we end this video. So the company was eager to stress at the time that the more modern production facility had not changed the original vehicle build philosophy of hand-built cars using the highest quality materials, and the reputation of the marque would be maintained. So let's dismantle this a little bit. So firstly, they were very eager to stress that the initial philosophy of high quality hand-built cars, that hadn't changed. So they're still emphasizing this high quality, luxurious approach to producing vehicles, and that's important because they need to maintain that brand image. It's an integral part of the company. It's perhaps its biggest selling point, and it's why the cars can kind of sell themselves in a sense. Important, as we've said, to not rely too much on that, but you can't cut that out completely. That's a big part of what the company is, and it's very important that they did emphasize this and didn't go on and start to be associated or start to be thought of as going into mass production. And the other thing to take from this is the word marque. So a marque is a word used to refer to the make of a car rather than a specific model. So you have a marque such as a Bentley or a Ferrari or a Porsche or an Aston Martin, rather than a specific model like a Fiesta, which is a model of a Ford, or a Polo for Volkswagen. So a marque it's not a model, it's a kind of brand of car. Like to say I have an Aston Martin is the marque. The Aston Martin itself could be a DB9, a DB11, or whatever it is, and that would be the make. So that's what marque means. And that's for those of you who don't know a whole lot about the car industry. I'm sure by the end of this you'll know a hell of a lot more about the car industry than you ever thought you would. Okay, so moving on to the final paragraph of this section then. So more recently, DOM, remember who DOM, they are the owner, they own 60% stake in Ashworth Lea. After another change in its corporate policy, they have sold the majority of its stake to the industrial investment conglomerate INV Group. This leaves the ownership split three ways. the families of the original owners with 40%. DOM now have only 15%, sorry, so they've gone from 60% down to 15%, and the investment group now have 45%. So the investment group of the three has the highest stake in the company, with the original owners of the family having less now than the main investment group, and DOM only having 15%, so that's only a small interest left for DOM, who had come in and saved the company, remember, back in the 1980s. So this means now that DOM have very little influence, with only 15%. They're probably just sort of raking in the sort of their share of the profits year on year. The investment group have a larger influence with 45%, so they're going to be more involved in the company, in what it's doing, and sort of providing funding to make sure that the company can do what it needs to do. And the original owners have also a fairly high influence as well, slightly less than the investment group, but it's still a fairly reasonable amount left themselves. Okay, so that'll do it in terms of content for what we're going to look at in this video, just this first few pages. So what we're going to do now, before we finish, is actually do a very quick SWOT analysis based on the information we've been given so far. So let's just find a bit of room to do that. So just as a reminder, a SWOT analysis is a way of analysing company to see its strengths and its weaknesses, and that's looking internally, looking inward, so the strengths of the company as it is and the weaknesses within that company internally, and then opportunities and threats are external to the company. So what opportunities does the company can they make the most of externally, what is available to them, and the same thing with threats, what external threats are going to make it difficult for the company to continue to operate. So why don't you take a minute or two now just to pause the video and have a think about some of the key strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats that Ashworth Lea face, just based on this first few pages that we've looked at so far. Okay, so let's start with the strengths then. So what are the strengths that Ashworth Lea have, just based on what we've seen so far? So something that's been emphasized again and again in this pre-scene is their reputation for high quality, and this is directly feeding into their brand image. So a great strength that Ashworth Lea have is their brand image. They're sort of instantly recognizable, sells itself, associated with kind of luxury and cool. If we hark back to this kind of James Bond comparison that we made earlier, it's that kind of a car that people just want. It's a cool car. Not everyone's going to ever have one of these cars. It's obviously a sort of very expensive car. Only certain groups of the market are going to be able to afford it, but that's a strength for the company, because you can put their badge anywhere and people will say, oh, that's Ashworth Lea, that's a cool car. So that's definitely a strength that they have. But let's think about some of their weaknesses. So a very clear weakness we can get from the fact that the company almost failed around 30 years ago, and that was due to perhaps two things: a lack of a marketing strategy, so relying too much on their brand image and their reputation, and a lack of innovation, so not pushing themselves to invest in new technologies and develop new models of car. They became stale, and they suffered for it, and they almost went out of business for it. So that was certainly a weakness, and if it happened once, it could certainly happen again if they're not careful. So that's a weakness and something that could potentially happen again. Hopefully it's not, but certainly something to bring up at this point. Okay, so let's move on next to opportunities. Now, what things in the car industry and the way that the car industry is going, what things could Ashworth Lea take advantage of and use to their advantage, in that way making it an opportunity for them? So two things immediately come to mind here, something that we've mentioned already: driverless cars and electric cars. So of the two, electric cars are probably more relevant for now. This is something that's already been done on a fairly large scale by companies such as Tesla, who are producing electric cars, fully electric cars that use hydrogen instead of petroleum. They're environmentally friendly and efficient, and eventually within the next 10 to 20 years they're probably going to be far more popular, and you're going to see a lot more of those kind of cars on the road. Driverless cars, they're being invested in at this stage. They're being developed still. They're probably still a fair way off of those being released to the public anytime soon, but it's certainly something that seems very likely to be a very popular product in the next 30, 50 years or so. And so these two things are definite directions in which the automotive industry is going. And so Ashworth Lea could jump behind these and invest in these developments and make sure that they're not left behind when the market inevitably goes that way. Finally, let's think about threats to Ashworth Lea. So one thing could be outdated technology. This is perhaps something that happened to them in the past when they almost failed. They weren't investing enough in new production and new designs. So it's quite possible that the opportunities that we've discussed, driverless cars and electric cars, could also be a threat if Ashworth Lea decide not to go down that route. This seems to be the way that the car industry is going, and so if they don't get behind it, it's going to be a threat to them because they're going to have outdated technology, and people are going to find it harder and harder to associate Ashworth Lea with the kind of luxury, high quality brand when they'll move from that to kind of a collector's antique kind of relic of an older era of car production when petrol was still used, and it would be tougher and tougher for them to stay relevant when they're not competing in the modern marketplace. Okay, so hopefully if you did this yourself, you came up with most of these, or at least jotted them down, and perhaps you came up with a few things yourself that I didn't actually specifically mention, and that's great. Those are things that you can use. Take note of those, keep them in your notes, and they may well be something to think about when it comes to the exam. All that remains for me to say is thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it. And I'll just take a few moments of your time, if I could, to just tell you about some of the other case study materials that we offer. So one of the things is a study text. Now this is a study text specifically aimed at the case study, and we have one for each level. So we have an operational, management and strategic level one, and they're designed to help you pass the study. They're in two halves. The first half is exam tips and exam strategy and advice on how to answer questions and all the really useful kind of tips that you need going into these exams and how to prepare for them. And then the second half, the second part of those, is a recap of the key theory that always comes up in the case studies again and again. So those are really useful, really valuable thing that you can get. Those are available online, and you can get an actual textbook, a printed physical textbook for the old-fashioned among you who like to do it that way still. We also have course videos that correspond with that study text as well. So we have a series of really nicely well-produced, well-done videos in which we basically take you through exactly what's involved in the case study and how you can spend your time preparing for it to ensure that you get really good marks. It's really, really great series of videos there. We've got the Preseen analysis, which the video you just watched is an example of the Preseen analysis, and there'll be several more videos just like that where we look at every tiny detail of the Preseen and we relate it back to the P1 or F1 or E1, and we relate it to real life scenarios, relate it to actual business and analysis tools, and we give you the what we expect to be the top 10 issues. Another thing that we do slightly different is the industry analysis, and that is this is a really great document in which we basically cover everything that's relevant to the industry for the particular business that we're looking at, and it goes from their history through to the customers and suppliers and the market and how the market has functioned and the history of that. And we've got statistics in there and diagrams, and it's full of information. It's so useful. And at the end of that pack, we also have 25 actual industry examples, so real life things that have happened in that industry, that kind of examples of things that might actually happen to the company in the exam. So it gives you a sense of the kind of things that are going on in the industry and how real life businesses in that industry have coped with it. We have mock exams, which are, if you were going to pick any one of these to do, I would suggest it was the mock exams, because nothing prepares you for the exam more than actually sitting a mock exam. And if I were a student taking this, I would certainly put mock exams at the top of my list, along with marking and feedback. Now, our mock exams are actually designed to match the way that the actual CIMA exams are, so you can sit them on your laptop and they'll be timed and automatic, and they are as close as you are going to get to the real thing. And you can get marking and feedback on that as well, which is probably the most valuable thing you could probably get. To get specific feedback from a marker who deals with this exam 4 times a year, that's the best way for you to improve your ability to pass this exam as quickly as possible. We also have a masterclass, so as an online company we hold an online masterclass which you can sign up for, and it's a day over the weekend. We do the Saturday and a Sunday, and it's a full day's worth of we have an expert who takes an online seminar, and we go through everything specific to that case study that you can do to get prepared for the exam, and we cover all sorts, and it's very, very popular among students who like a one-on-one kind of classroom environment in an online situation. We also offer pass guarantee, so if you're unlucky enough to not pass your exam the first time round, then there's no worries, because we give you the option. If you choose a pass guarantee option, then as long as you hit all the minimum requirements that we ask, and you don't pass, then you get access to our materials for the next sitting completely free of charge. So there's something that we're doing to try and get you. Hopefully, if you signed up to our course and you do everything that we say you should do, then you probably will pass first time. That tends to be the way it goes. But if you should be unfortunate, if it's a particularly tough exam, then we'll let you have another go for free. So that's it. Thanks again for watching. Remember, my name is James. You can find me on Facebook, James Nutting Astranti, where I'll be posting all sorts of information about the upcoming exam in February. Make sure you check that out because there's always something to talk about with regards to that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.